Father Mark Sullivan had led the tiny parish of St. Agnes for nearly 20 years, his days a gentle rhythm of prayer, confessions, and the quiet echo of footsteps in the cool nave. On a winter dawn, glazed with frost, he unlocked the old wooden doors as pale light streamed through stained glass, casting rubies and sapphires onto worn pews. His eyes were weary, carrying shadows of grief ever since his younger brother passed away from cancer, a loss that left him questioning the comfort he was supposed to give others. He moved toward the altar, murmuring his morning prayers, the scent of wax and incense wrapping around him like a thin blanket. Everything seemed still, as it always was at this hour, until a sudden rustling noise echoed from the side of the church, sharp as a gasp. He turned, heart thumping, and saw a sleek black cat slink out from under a pew, its green eyes glinting with secrets. It moved with predatory grace, tail flicking as it approached the holy water font near the entrance. Then, in a motion too quick to stop, the cat leapt and plunged headfirst into the shallow pool. Ripples fanned out in the marble basin, water spilling over the edge, shimmering under the flickering votive candles. And that was the moment everything ordinary about St. Agnes would begin to unravel. You won't believe how this story ends. It's a tale that will touch even the hardest hearts, and what emerged from that water would leave an entire congregation trembling with wonder and tears. Father Mark froze in place, gripping the edge of the lectern, eyes wide as he watched droplets fly through the still air like tiny diamonds. The cat didn't thrash or scramble to escape. Instead, it seemed to dive deeper, its sleek form nearly disappearing in the small font. He rushed forward, robes swishing against the stone floor, but halted as a soft golden glow began pulsing beneath the surface. It was faint at first, like moonlight filtered through fog, but then grew sharper, spreading warmth through the icy air. For a split second, Father Mark felt an inexplicable sense of peace, as if the grief he carried had momentarily lifted from his chest. He blinked rapidly, unable to comprehend what his eyes were seeing. The water, once perfectly clear, now shimmered with a swirl of brilliant colors, almost like liquid stained glass. He glanced around the silent church, half expecting someone else to appear and confirm he wasn't losing his mind. But the pews were empty, shadows bending along the walls like silent witnesses, and just as he leaned closer, a tiny, trembling paw broke the surface, gripping the marble rim as if something, or someone, was trying to climb out. The black cat pulled itself free, soaked to the bone, but its fur now seemed shot through with shimmering strands of gold and silver, glittering in the faint candlelight. Father Mark stumbled backward, feeling the thump of his heart echo through the silent sanctuary, unable to look away. Water poured off the animal's flanks, pooling at its feet, as the glow around it pulsed like a gentle heartbeat. The cat blinked slowly, fixing Father Mark with a gaze that felt impossibly knowing, as though it could peer into every hidden place of his soul. A single drop fell from its whiskers, landing on the marble floor and sizzling like hot oil, leaving behind a faint symbol that Father Mark didn't recognize. He knelt closer, eyes straining to make out the shape, a rush of old Latin prayers spilling from his lips. The symbol glowed for a moment, before fading into nothingness. The cat meowed, voice soft but echoing strangely through the arches above. Father Mark reached out a trembling hand, compelled beyond reason, but hesitated an inch from touching its damp fur. Outside, the morning bells of St. Agnes began tolling the hour, their deep notes trembling through stone and stained glass. Father Mark staggered to his feet, suddenly aware of how cold the air felt against his skin, how his breath clouded as though he'd stepped into a winter storm. The cat sat calmly on the font's edge, water still dripping from its sleek body, eyes half closed as if meditating. Every sound seemed magnified, the creak of old wood, the drip of holy water hitting the marble floor, the distant shuffle of footsteps on icy pavement outside. A hush fell over the sanctuary, so profound that Father Mark thought he could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the pillars. He stared at the cat, desperate to understand what he'd just witnessed, but equally afraid of what it might mean. His faith, once solid as the church's stone walls, suddenly felt as fragile as stained glass. And though the bells finished tolling, the silence that followed felt deeper than any he'd ever known. He wanted to run, to escape this impossible moment, to pretend he'd seen nothing and lock the church doors behind him. But something in the cat's gaze rooted him to the spot. a strange mix of sorrow and ancient wisdom shimmering in those green-gold eyes. The animal turned its head slightly, as if beckoning him closer, and for a moment Father Mark imagined he heard a faint voice whispering in a language older than Latin. His chest tightened, his breath coming faster, and he felt the weight of his brother's memory pressing on him with unbearable tenderness. The cat gave a soft, plaintive cry, and Father Mark realized with a shock that he could almost sense the creature's own fear and exhaustion. This was no ordinary animal, no mere stray looking for warmth in the winter chill. And deep in his heart, something whispered that whatever had just emerged from the holy water was here for him, and him alone. He knew that if he turned away now, he'd regret it for the rest of his life. And as the cat lowered its head, shaking droplets from its whiskers, Father Mark made a silent vow that he would not abandon whatever mystery fate had placed in his path. Father Mark reached out with shaking fingers, barely brushing the cat's damp fur, and felt a jolt of warmth run up his arm, as though he'd touched sunlight instead of wet hair. The cat didn't flinch, but leaned into his touch, eyes half-lidded, as if comforted by the contact. A sudden wave of grief and longing surged in Father Mark's chest, so vivid it almost took his breath away, the memory of his brother's laughter echoing in his ears. He drew back, gasping, staring at the creature as water pooled around their feet. Outside, wind rattled the stained glass windows, casting flickering shards of color across the cat's golden-tipped fur. The silence inside felt sacred and heavy, as though the very walls were listening. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his thoughts, but nothing about this moment felt earthly or explainable. Part of him wanted to drag the cat outside, away from the holy water, and lock the doors behind them. Yet another part, deeper and truer, knew this animal carried some hidden purpose, and the look in its luminous eyes seemed to say, "Don't turn away from me." Father Mark stood frozen between fear and a rising, impossible hope. Beneath the flickering candles, he took a closer look at the cat's body and noticed faint scars hidden beneath the wet fur, thin white lines winding like pale threads across its shoulders and flanks. Each mark seemed to catch the candlelight, glimmering for a heartbeat before vanishing back into shadow. The cat breathed rapidly, chest rising and falling as droplets clung to its whiskers like tiny pearls. Its paws trembled slightly, leaving delicate wet prints on the marble ledge of the font. Father Mark felt his heart twist at the sight of those scars, evidence that this creature had suffered, perhaps even been hunted. He leaned closer, examining the cat's sides, and caught the faint scent of salt and old stone, like ocean air mingled with the cool dampness of the church. The cat let out a quiet, choked meow, its voice breaking like a sob, and Father Mark's resolve crumbled further. He could see a shadow of pain in the creature's eyes, and a flicker of something else too, gratitude maybe, or pleading. His own eyes filled with sudden tears. He whispered softly, "What happened to you?" He glanced around the church, suddenly aware of how strange this must look. A priest, soaked to the elbows, crouching beside a dripping cat that seemed to glow. If anyone from the parish walked in right now, Mrs. Kersey with her rosary beads, or the altar boys running late for morning mass, how would he explain this? He thought of the bishop, stern and traditional, who already worried about dwindling attendance and Father Mark's distracted sermons. A scandal over a miracle cat could tear apart the fragile respect he'd managed to hold on to after his brother's death. Gossip would fly through town like wildfire, newspapers sniffing for a supernatural headline. Yet as he stared at the trembling creature, Father Mark realized he couldn't just throw it out into the snow, as though none of this had happened. A part of him, the part that still clung to hope, even after loss, believed that this cat might be an answer to prayers he'd never dared speak aloud. His mind raced with consequences, but his heart was already deciding, and the weight of that choice pressed upon his chest like an invisible hand. The cat shifted suddenly, leaping down from the font and landing with a wet splat on the stone floor, scattering droplets in all directions. It limped slightly on one hind leg, confirming Father Mark's suspicion that it was injured, and a small red stain bloomed beneath its paw where it stepped. Father Mark lunged forward, panic flashing through him, trying to catch the cat before it darted away. But the cat merely looked up at him, blinking with those deep, ancient eyes as though waiting for his next move. He dropped to his knees again, heedless of his robes soaking in the puddles, and cupped the animal's face gently. His thumb brushed over one of the shimmering golden strands in its fur, and for a heartbeat, he felt warmth radiating into his skin. A sudden image burst behind his eyelids. His brother, standing in sunlight, smiling, whole and alive. The vision faded as quickly as it came, leaving Father Mark trembling and breathless. He stared into the cat's eyes, realizing he couldn't let it suffer. Not when he'd just seen proof that miracles might still be possible. He drew in a shaky breath, blinking away tears, and finally found his voice. "I don't know who you are, or what you are," he whispered, voice hoarse, "but I'm not leaving you here." Gently he gathered the cat into his arms, feeling its fragile bones beneath the soft, damp fur. The cat didn't resist, only curled closer against his chest, emitting a faint, rumbling purr that seemed to vibrate through his ribs. He rose to his feet, cradling the creature, and turned toward the sacristy door, determined to find towels, warmth, and perhaps an answer to this impossible mystery. As he stepped forward, the cat raised its head and let out a single musical cry that echoed strangely off the stone walls, almost like a word half-spoken. Father Mark hesitated, realizing he had just crossed an invisible line between duty and something far more personal. He glanced once more at the holy water font shimmering faintly under candlelight and whispered a silent prayer for courage. Because deep in his soul, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't walk away anymore. Father Mark carried the cat into the sacristy, the warmth of its small body seeping into his chest as he pushed through the heavy wooden door. The familiar scent of incense and old linens hit him like a wave, bringing a strange comfort as he gently laid the animal on a clean white altar cloth. He grabbed a stack of soft towels from the cabinet and carefully began drying the cat's fur, feeling it shiver beneath his hands. Candlelight flickered across the creature's damp body, picking out threads of silver and gold woven through its dark coat. Every so often, the cat let out a tiny mewl, eyes squeezing shut, as Father Mark worked around the small wound on its paw. He found a bottle of holy oil used for anointing and dabbed it gently on the raw skin, whispering a prayer for healing. To his astonishment, the red gash seemed to close a fraction, the angry swelling receding as if soothed by invisible hands. He blinked hard, refusing to believe his eyes, but the proof glistened right in front of him. For the first time in months, he felt his chest unclench, as though the crushing weight of grief had lifted, if only slightly. And deep inside, a fragile seed of hope began to stir. The cat raised its head and gave him a slow, deliberate stare, its green eyes filled with something impossibly human, a mixture of gratitude and deep sorrow. Father Mark paused, towel half raised, struck by the sense that this creature wasn't merely an animal, but a bearer of secrets older than any church. Its gaze seemed to pierce through him, peeling away layers of doubt, grief, and the hollow ache left by his brother's death. For a moment he felt as though he were standing at the threshold of something sacred and terrifying, the thin place between the earthly and the divine. The cat blinked once slowly and lowered its head to rest on the altar cloth, purring softly, the sound like distant bells ringing over water. Father Mark touched its forehead gently, murmuring, "Who sent you here?" But of course the cat offered no answer. Still, in the hush of the sacristy, Father Mark could almost swear he heard a faint whispering, like words carried on a breeze through the church arches. He felt goosebumps rise along his arms, the sensation both eerie and strangely comforting. It was as though someone, or something, wanted him to listen. Minutes later, the quiet was shattered by footsteps pounding in the nave, followed by the clatter of the sacristy door swinging open. Deacon Ramirez burst inside, eyes wide, his breath misting in the cold air, rosary beads swinging wildly around his wrist. "Father Mark." The bells rang out of time, and Mrs. Kersey said there was light pouring out of the font, he cried, voice quivering. He froze when his eyes fell on the black and gold cat lying calmly on the altar cloth. His mouth fell open as he took in the shimmering fur, the faint glow radiating from the animal's body. Father Mark stepped protectively in front of the cat, heart hammering, torn between confessing everything and shielding this fragile secret. Ramirez's eyes darted between the cat and Father Mark, as if trying to piece together a puzzle too strange to believe. For a moment, Silence hung between them like a taut wire, every breath weighted with possibility. Outside, the wind howled through the stained glass, rattling it in its frames. The scent of holy oil seemed sharper, filling the air with a potent, expectant tang. And deep in Father Mark's soul, he knew he was standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything. Ramirez stepped closer, voice lowered to a trembling whisper. "Father, is that a sign? Or something dangerous?" His eyes glistened with fear, fingers clutching the rosary tight enough to leave red grooves in his skin. Father Mark hesitated, struggling for the right words, the weight of his collar pressing against his throat. Part of him wanted to tell Ramirez the entire story. The dive into the holy water, the glow, the wound that seemed to heal. Yet another part recoiled from the thought of the cat becoming a spectacle, paraded as a miracle for the curious or the skeptical. He looked down at the creature, who met his gaze calmly, as though aware of the stakes hanging in the air. Ramirez pressed on, voice breaking. "If this is holy, we must tell the bishop. But if it's not, Father, what if this is a trick? A test?" Father Mark swallowed hard, knowing that whichever path he chose would either protect this fragile being or expose it to forces beyond his control. He clenched his fists around the damp towel, feeling his pulse pound in his temples, and then he realized the answer was already inside him. The cat wasn't just here for a sign, it was here for him. He drew in a long breath, steadying his voice, and looked Ramirez square in the eyes. "No one else needs to know, not yet," he said firmly. "This cat, it's hurt and it needs our help. That's all we need to focus on right now." Ramirez opened his mouth to argue, but fell silent as the cat lifted its head and let out a quiet, musical trill that seemed to vibrate through the room. Father Mark felt something shift inside him, a certainty blooming where doubt used to live. Gently, he gathered the cat into his arms again, the creature pressing closer to his chest, as though drawing strength from his heartbeat. He turned back toward the church, determined to keep this secret safe until he understood what it meant. The candles flickered as he stepped through the sacristy door, casting tall shadows on the stone walls, and for the first time in a long while, Father Mark felt that maybe, just maybe, he was being led toward healing. A warmth glowed in his chest, echoing the golden threads in the cat's fur, and as the church bells began tolling again, he realized he no longer felt so alone. Over the following days, St. Agnes became a different kind of sacred space, echoing not only with hymns but with the soft patter of feline paws exploring every corner. Father Mark set up a small bed beside the sacristy heater, laying old altar linens into a cozy nest for the cat, who curled up there each night, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The wound on its paw healed so swiftly that even Ramirez stared in disbelief, shaking his head and crossing himself every time he passed. The congregation began to notice Father Mark's renewed energy, his sermons filling with warmth and conviction that had been missing for months. Parishioners whispered about the Father's new cat, though few had seen it up close, as Father Mark kept the creature close, protective as a father with a fragile child. The cat would sometimes follow him up the aisle during Mass, padding silently beside his robes, its presence a quiet, radiant mystery. When Father Mark prayed, he often found the cat seated beside him, eyes half closed as if deep in silent worship. The glow in its fur had faded somewhat, though golden flecks still caught the light whenever it moved, and though he never spoke of the holy water incident again, Father Mark knew his life had been forever changed. He felt the weight of grief begin to lift like incense swirling toward the rafters. In small gestures, the transformation became undeniable. Father Mark found himself rising earlier each day, driven by an unfamiliar anticipation as he unlocked the church doors. He smiled more often, his eyes no longer shadowed with sorrow, and laughter returned to his voice in gentle waves. The cat seemed to sense his moods, curling into his lap whenever sadness threatened to break through, purring so deeply it vibrated through his bones. Ramirez, once skeptical and fearful, grew protective of the animal as well, bringing in tins of soft food and fresh water from home. Even Mrs. Kersey, who once called cats creatures of mischief, began leaving knitted blankets for the feline's bed. The cat accepted all of it with quiet dignity, sometimes flicking its tail in gentle approval, other times pressing its nose to parishioners' hands in an unspoken blessing. Father Mark noticed how the congregation lingered longer after services, drawn into conversations that blossomed into laughter and shared stories. Where there had once been emptiness, there was now gentle life. And every time the cat glanced up at him with those luminous eyes, Father Mark felt the ghost of his brother smiling somewhere just beyond reach. Outside the walls of St. Agnes, whispers of the mysterious cat began to seep into the wider community. A few townspeople insisted they'd glimpsed golden light shining through stained glass at odd hours of the night. Others claimed they'd seen Father Mark speaking softly to the cat as though conversing with a person, his face lit up with joy. A local newspaper reporter called 3 times asking for an interview, but Father Mark politely declined, determined to shield the cat from becoming a public curiosity or a target for those seeking miracles. Yet despite his efforts to keep the story contained, word spread quietly about the priest and his miraculous cat. Strangers began slipping into the back pews during Sunday Mass, curious and wide-eyed, hoping for a glimpse of the creature that had supposedly healed a priest's broken heart. Donations to the church began to rise, not out of spectacle, but because people felt drawn to a place where hope still flickered. And while Father Mark worried about unwanted attention, he couldn't deny that St. Agnes was finally alive with warmth and community once more. He wondered if that too was part of the cat's hidden mission. Sometimes late at night, Father Mark would sit alone in the nave, the cat perched beside him, gazing up at the towering crucifix above the altar. The flickering candles cast long shadows across the stained glass, transforming the walls into shifting murals of light and color. He would speak softly, confessing his lingering sorrow, his fears, his guilt for having wavered in faith. The cat would answer with a soft rumble, pressing close to his side, as if reminding him that love never truly disappears, it merely changes shape. One night, as snow fell silently outside, Father Mark felt the cat's fur glow faintly gold again, and he closed his eyes, picturing his brother's face radiant with laughter. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but they were no longer tears of despair. Instead, they were a gentle release, washing away the sharpest edges of grief. He whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't certain if he was speaking to the cat, to God, or to the memory of his brother. And for the first time, he believed that miracles weren't always grand spectacles. Sometimes they arrived on silent paws, carrying hope in unexpected forms. Months later, St. Agnes hosted a community meal in the parish hall, tables crowded with parishioners, neighbors, and even strangers who'd been drawn in by tales of kindness and healing. The cat wove gracefully between chairs, earning gentle pats and soft exclamations of delight, its sleek fur still catching flashes of gold beneath the light fixtures. Father Mark moved through the crowd, greeting each person with genuine warmth, no longer haunted by the distant look that once clouded his eyes. Ramirez, grinning, announced that St. Agnes had raised enough donations to repair the crumbling bell tower, a symbol of new life ringing out over the town. As laughter rose and plates clinked, Father Mark paused to watch the cat settle into the lap of an elderly man, weeping softly, comfort radiating from the gentle weight of its presence. The cat lifted its head, fixing Father Mark with an intent, glowing gaze, as if to say that the work was not yet done. And Father Mark realized this was not merely about healing his own grief, but about helping others find light in their darkness. He smiled, feeling the warmth of purpose pulse through him again. He didn't just save a cat. He found the missing pieces of himself, and as the cat blinked slowly, purring like a hymn, Father Mark understood that sometimes the most divine miracles arrived not in visions of angels or thundering voices from the heavens, but in the quiet devotion of a creature whose eyes seemed to hold eternity. In the weeks and years that followed, he carried that lesson into every sermon, every moment of comfort offered to a grieving widow, every prayer whispered over a hospital bed. St. Agnes became a place whispered about far beyond town lines, not because of spectacle, but because people sensed something sacred lingering there, gentle yet powerful. And whenever doubt threatened to creep back into his soul, Father Mark would feel the brush of a silken tail around his ankles, reminding him that love and wonder were never as far away as he once believed. The golden threads in the cat's fur were fading, but the miracle they'd sparked blazed brighter than ever in his heart. And as the sun streamed through stained glass one quiet morning, Father Mark lifted his eyes to heaven, murmuring a prayer of gratitude for the creature who saved his faith. For he knew now, without a single doubt, he didn't just save a cat, he found himself.